Welcome back. As mentioned, we're now going to open up the forum to questions from the audience for several of our presenters that we heard just before the break. If you have a question, please make use of the live Q&A function. There you can type and submit your question. Otherwise, click on the hand icon inside of the live Q&A, and that will bring you to my attention. And when it's your turn, we'll enable your video and microphone so you can ask the question this way. So please remember the live Q&A is there. So if you want to ask questions of the panel members, I'll just quickly, we've got a couple of questions that have already came through. I think I'm just looking at these questions. I think we've got one here for yourself, Peter. And I think that's going to be a live queue from Marika.
Hello. Hi, Peter. How you going? Great presentations, everybody, by the way. It was really informative. Fantastic job. So, Peter, Uluru and Kakadu are some of the most well-known joint management arrangements. Can you please elaborate on your experience with these?
Hi, all there. Thanks, Marika. Yeah, so where I start, so I think maybe just a bit more on Uluru. I've definitely had more experience at Uluru than Kakadu. I assume, as people know, Uluru is a World Heritage Area. It's has really high visitation. There's a community within the park, which is really quite unique, Murajulu. There's a legislated board, so the Board of Management, and we're talking about, I think we're 30 to 40 years of joint management at Uluru. It was 1985, I think the land was handed back. And handed back in quite a hostile political environment, you would say at the time. There was quite a public or a backlash from the NT government at the time. But I think, it's been a really up and down or a bit of a roller coaster experience at Uluru. I think there's been some really, really good times, and certainly Anang will talk about the good times. Maybe not as good at the moment, but certainly not too bad. And people there are still, or Ananga is still keen to stay in a joint management relationship. But I've heard sort of Sammy Wilson, the ex-chair of the board, say to me, we still want joint management. We just want joint management to be what it was kind of made out to be, or what it was promised to be. But I would say that definitely the board is, majority traditional owners, chaired by a traditional owner, and quite a strong board. But there's a real tension and tussle there with Uluru being such a high visited park that a lot of the focus tends to be on visitor management, and sometimes then traditional owner priorities get left behind or sort of don't get addressed in the sense, and the sort of park management can be dominated by the visitor management issues, which might not actually be a priority of traditional owners. Having said that, things depending on what can depend on the capacity of park staff as well, and their aptitude to engage in joint management. And that will fluctuate depending on the clientele at any particular time. And I think so that it can go up and down. There's I'll pull up there, Bill. I could keep going, but I don't know if there's any, Marika, if there's anything else you want to know about or others want to know about, maybe throw another question in.
All right, thanks, Peter. I think we have another live question from Jose for is Dermot online yet? Sorry. No. Okay, what I'll do is I'll ask this question for Kathy and Jim. This came from the YMAC board. Did joint management results result in an increase in funding? And also, Jim, YMAC want to just let you and Kieran know they would like to come over for a visit to your country. So the question from the YMAC board was, did joint management increase funding, Jim?
Agreement was finalised. There's basically funding in perpetuity. So the Wutherity Aboriginal Corporation agreed that area could become national. So let me start back. Everywhere is different, so every situation is different. The land previously was a pastoral holding. So the reason it's tenure focused is a pastoral holding, and there was a negotiation went on to decide which bits would be national park and which bits would be Wutherity Aboriginal freehold, and then they would decide how that was managed. So that's the first thing to understand. And the different tenures is every time a parcel lease is bought, you've got them running across Aboriginal nations or Aboriginal groups, so that needs to be then renegotiated and tried to put back into one group. So at the moment, Wutherity Nation, Wutherity people are spread across two corporations because the government has run it through a tenure focus. So every time you do get a national park agreed, there's a money in perpetuity that's provided. Now, we're an Oro corporation, so we're going to turn over about $2 million this year. They're going to provide about $187,000 of that $2 million. So that answers that question, I suppose, if there's money in perpetuity. Previously, it was about 167. We just got a 10% increase. There'd be nothing happened for 5 years, so that's happened. So I think I might just leave it there, but that might give you a context in terms of the joint management funding and then the broader funding that we bring in to run the corporation.
Thanks, Jim. Kathy, did you see an increase in funding once joint management come on board?
Yeah. So Glowac's sort of going through our review of our RSA at the moment, negotiating that. And yeah, like it has kind of increased funding. We've got the bushfire recovery stuff here, so that's kind of helped our employment as well. Yeah, so we're kind of getting money thrown at us all directions here, and trying to build up ranger teams is trying to sort of keep the capacity of that going too. So, and and still the rangers looking after the parks and our campgrounds and stuff here. So yeah, it's there's lots of funds there for Glowac.
Cool, thanks, Kathy. I just want to do a follow-up question, Kathy, on that. Through the video, we've got some really good highlights of the way the rangers, their interaction with country was there. What are some of the best outcomes provided by joint management from your experience?
Probably, seeing such, young mob being employed and working and being sort of connected back to country. That's kind of like from my point of view, like, or personally seeing the rangers grow you know, in such a short time. Like, yeah, like we have now, you know, in our 8 ranges, like there's fire roles, you know, like we've got half of our JM rangers, they're trained in to start, you know, sort of working on seasonal, well, like over summer, we've got our summer crew that actually go and fight fires and stuff with other organisations. So yeah, it's kind of that's sort of been a big highlight, like seeing them grow in those sort of positions, and yeah, and just getting them back out on country and being connected. Yeah.
Thanks, Kathy. Yeah, it's good to see that growth when people are out on country and connecting to country and working for country. Yeah.
Yeah.
We have a live question from Jose to Dermot. Are we able to bring up Jose to ask that live question for Dermot?
Yeah, thank you, Bill, and thank you to all the presenters. And Dermot, yeah, this question is for you. How much do you think the international agenda has influenced the emergence and especially the expansion of the IPA network in Australia? I'm thinking particularly, you know, in the last 10 or 15 years with the IG target number 11 under the Convention on International Biodiversity. It might be a coincidence, but obviously in the last 12 years, there's been a tremendous expansion of the IPA network. So I was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Yes, look, I think a strong connection between international policy developments and the establishment of the IPA program. I mentioned in my presentation that it was the 1994 definition of a protected area developed by the IUCN that really made the IPAs possible. And that came out of discussions at a series of World Parks Congresses, which are held every 10 years. And in particular, it was one in Venezuela, then one in Bali, one in South Africa, and the last one held in Sydney. And each one of those stimulate another growth of recognition of Indigenous rights and interests in protected area. But once that 1994 definition was established and taken on board by Australian governments, particularly the federal government, the IPA program kicked off. And I think after that, the IPA program influenced the international agenda more than the other way around. What was happening internationally over the last 10 or 20 years has been the development of Indigenous community conserved areas, which are a little bit like IPAs, but they are not recognized as protected areas. They're something slightly different. And also they don't allow for this idea of a country-based approach. So I think the IPA program has been unique and is now being looked very closely by Canada, where they're developing their own equivalent of Indigenous protected areas in Canada. So like all these things, it's sort of exchanging of ideas, trying them out and then passing them on. And similarly, the idea of sea country IPAs, where Indigenous people can dedicate their sea country as an IPA, even though they don't have legal recognition of ownership of the sea, that was a uniquely Australian idea, which has now been explored in other parts of the world by coastal and marine Indigenous people. However, the Commonwealth government may well have been influenced by these more recent international developments, like the Aichi targets, would have encouraged them to continue investing in IPA programs. But I think there's been one of the features of the IPA program development is that it has had bipartisan support from both sides or all sides of politics in Australia. And it's been, you know, as you said, it's been growing quite rapidly, and I think is a pretty secure form of investment now. It's not likely to be under threat.
Thanks for that, Dermot. We have another live question. It's good that live questions are coming in. Offers a chance for people to ask their question through the video. We've got a question from Radhika. Can I bring Radhika up online for a question?
Hi, everyone. Thanks again, for all your presentations. It's been hugely valuable and really, really interesting. I've got a question for any of the groups that have an IPA and a jointly managed park over the same area. Does that complicate things? Because you get the benefit of additional resources from the IPA and you're able to have that completely Indigenous-led approach. But with the park, you also have joint management commitments and you need to work with the state. And there's obviously specific things that the state needs to spend money on and their own KPIs and things like that. So just wondering if you've experienced any issues with having the IPA and a jointly managed park over the same area.
I can comment on that if you like. I've worked in a previous Aboriginal corporation that had national parks and also IPAs, and we're just in the final stages of dedicating an IPA as well as having the national park and joint management. And so basically an Indigenous protected area has different levels of ICN, the international levels for protection. And so the way that Wutheri looked at it, and the way that the previous organisation I worked for looked at it, was the national parks sat within their broader management framework, which was their overall plan for their country. And what we did at the previous organisation is national parks want to come out and do a plan for their national park. And we just gone through a whole process to run an Indigenous protected area plan and covered a lot of those, well, pretty much all of those issues for the national park as well. Because when you talk to elders and the like, they all look at the land holistically. They don't necessarily see all the tenures. They see their connection, their family's connection, other clan groups' connection, how all that fits together. So I'm sure people understand that. So basically what we do is go back to government and say, you need to look at your national park within the broader Indigenous protected area framework. And I had to go and engage with the minister to get the national parks to change the way that they engage with us, because in the end they wanted to run a similar process around the national park that we'd already run around an Indigenous protected area. And we basically said that we're not doing that. We don't want to waste our time and your money, and particularly to have bureaucrats come and travel around and talk to people about things they've already talked about through native title and then through Indigenous protected areas to some extent. So what we do is go back to government and say, this is Wutheri's plan, or this is Jabal Binnem's plan, was the previous organisation. How does your planning fit with that? And then we have our board and some of our elders at times sit down and work that through in terms of the national park plan. But the overall holistic plan drives the agenda, not the narrow national park plan drives the agenda. Now that's a work in progress, and the department is very much focused on managing national parks. Our challenge is to change them to see, yes, the national park management is important, it needs to be Indigenous led, and how does that fit then within the broader Indigenous plan, Wutheri plan, Jabal Binnem plan, which is the Indigenous protected area plan or healthy country plan.
Thanks for that, Jim. There's some important points I think made there too, Jim. You know, it's ensuring that there isn't a cultural burnout and through the community by addressing these things in separate boxes as well. We have another question from Jody Neal for Peter. Was agreeing to long-term leases for the national parks a compromised outcome? So traditional owners under some duress, that is, seemed worth it because the areas may not have been recognised under land rights if TOs had not agreed, or they have avoided a long legal fight to get the recognition without agreeing to these leases. Pretty long question there. So yeah, as that long-term lease for national parks a compromised outcome?
Yeah, so the short answer is yes, that it's definitely a compromise, and yes, traditional owners are definitely under some duress in the sense of being able to claim national park land under the Land Rights Act. So yeah, and in in a lot of cases, it's not what traditional owners want or wanted. It's their land and they want full control. It's but I guess seen as a way to get land recognised and a compromise, but get some benefits through the joint management arrangements. But essentially we're definitely under some duress, and I mean more so in some areas than others, to be honest. I think Kakadoo's got its own unique history in relation to that. And national parks, Northern Territory national parks, couldn't be claimed under the Land Rights Act. As all that could be claimed under the Land Rights Act was essentially Crown land. And I can say it here, the NT government in the day actively put in place things to sort of thwart traditional owners' ability to put land claims on national parks, but they were put on the national parks as a matter of principle. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Peter. Also, just to follow up, Jim did mention for JAC, anytime you want to come over to country, give him an email and he'll have a yarn to Karen and try and set it up. Going further with the questions, we had a question from Alana Hawthorne, and she apologised if this has already been discussed or it's been missed. Alana states that she's aware that what's being discussed is a complex and governance heavy, and wondering how engagement is encouraged to the wider community groups in an accessible way that's relatable and comprehensive, i.e. further continuous engagement. So I'm going to open that up to the panel a bit if anybody wants to try and tackle that question. So it's about engagement and that continuous engagement. Does anybody want to handle that? No?
Either you're talking about community, are you talking about the broader Australian community? You're talking about the broader Wutherity community? Which is this clarification in relation to that?
I'll, as this was a question through the live Q&A from Alana, did you want to just quickly put in some clarity if it's the wider community, or are you talking about the wider Aboriginal community? If you can add that, I've got a hand up. If you can add that up, that'd be great. She's raised her hand. Do you want to try and bring her in, Georgia, Alana, to ask the question for clarity? We're just pulling Jim. We're just pulling Alana into the live question format. Hi, Alana. Do you want to propose your question again? Thank you.
Yeah, sorry. I was just meaning, I guess younger people and within each group's community, so not necessarily the wider Australian community. It's obviously a really complex issue, and a lot of these things are quite new to native title. So a lot of these things are, above my head, and I guess I found myself wondering how this is sort of communicated to people that aren't experienced with all of these phrases and acronyms and terms. How is it sort of put to them for engagement and continuous engagement in a more relatable way? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I can respond to that now. I think it's a really good question, because basically we're a registered native title body corporate and we hold the land in trust for Wutherity people, and there's a range of different tenures that we're dealing with. National parks are only interested in management of national parks, and yes, we can carve up some money to do something with young people, we can do something with women, or we can do something with another thing. What we try to do is basically focus across all of the different funders and partners that we can have come in And so we're looking at working with a philanthropic group to bring younger people and engage in this process and engage them with country. One of the benefits of having an Aboriginal run national park is it's not only relying on government funding, but we've got significant philanthropic funding coming in. We've also got the potential to bring in enterprise funding and a range of other funding. So the corporation is really there to enable that and facilitate that. And I think that's fundamentally the emphasis that Karen was trying to put across, is that you've got to have your own governance and your own agenda sorted out that's about your own law and custom. And then how does that work with the mainstream? Because at the moment, the funding, and it's not just about leases and other things, the regulatory framework sit the power there. So if you work at your own agenda, then you can bend that funding and other opportunities to support young people, to support elders, to support all the things you want to do within your broader Healthy Country Plan, Indigenous Protected Area Plan, and the National Park Planning sits within that. And obviously the different streams, we've got about 16 different streams of income at the moment, often grant and programmatically run, and it's impossible for all elders or young people to get their head around that. Wutheree people are really clear about the agenda that they want, and that's part of the reason they employ people like myself, because that's my expertise, to bend that and make that work as best they can for them. But it's an ongoing process of bringing and supporting community to be getting back on country, engaging with them. And that's the first value that Wutheree people have identified as Wutheree people on Wutheree Nachi, which means getting people back and reconnected to country.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, could I just add a comment there? Alana, thanks for that question. It's a really, really critical one. And I think it's the reason I was, in my presentation, I was talking about the benefit of doing whole of country planning, a bit like Jim was talking about as well, rather than leaping straight into negotiations about national park joint management, which is very technical and very focused on a particular part of country, you know, the national park part. It's very helpful to have have time and resources to do what I call country-based planning, where all of those issues and questions can be talked about and talked through and not rushed. One of the reasons I think the IPA program was successful is that, particularly in the early years, there was no deadline put on when traditional owners had to decide whether they wanted to go ahead with an IPA or not. They were given funding to consider the idea of an IPA before they committed to proceeding with it. And that allowed young people, traditional owners, elders to take plenty of time to understand what this was about and to see how that idea fitted in with their broader vision for country. So again, it's just having the time. The other thing is to build that into any management plan. So it's not just done one in the initial planning stage, but elders with young people continues throughout, you know, ongoing. Thank you.
Thanks. Dr. Bill Cruz, did you want to add to that comment as well?
Yeah, definitely. Whole of country planning is really important, and I think it was emphasised yesterday as well. But it needs to be whole of country planning that's also looking at economic development options as well as conservation. So we've had a few issues in WA where groups have done healthy country plans, but it hasn't really helped them make decisions about should they go ahead with a park versus should they go ahead with other activities like mining and pastoralism. And so it's, yeah, I think I just want to emphasize that whole of country planning, looking at conservation, economic development and everything else. And then you're in a good position to think about what choices you might want to make if you have them. The other thing is, in a lot of examples, groups have ended up with an IPA management plan, a healthy country plan, a joint management plan, a strategic plan. And there's a lot of work going on around WA at the moment with people just employed to bring the plans together into something that makes sense as one usable shorthand document, so the broader group can really understand the planning that's occurred in the different regimes. Thanks.
Thanks. So I've got a bit of a generic question for the panel, and And Kathy, I might start with you with this generic question, and then we'll just open it up to the rest of the floor. Have you encountered any misconceptions regarding what you and your communities you work with, what they believe joint management could deliver? Was there any misconceptions of like what it could deliver or misconceptions?
Not that I can think of. I'm probably not the right person to ask or answer. Not that I can think of. Yeah, like off the top of my head, for like in the joint managed space. So it's sort of worked really sort of well. Here with GLOWAC, like yeah, not that I can think of. Sorry.
That's all right, Kathy. I'll just open it up to the rest of the panel members if they wanted to answer some of that. You know, it's just if you've encountered any misconceptions regarding the community's idea or believed what joint management could actually deliver.
I'll chime in, Bill, if you like. I think it's an interesting one. I guess, you know, the employment is, you know, a big one that goes up and down, but possibly hasn't met expectations. But there's a sort of analysis that you could do to sort of look at, well, why, and both with, you know, maybe some traditional owners prefer to work for an IPA ranger group as opposed to parks, or, you know, what's actually going on, and that maybe hasn't hit the mark and what people's expectations were. And I think what parks agencies grapple with a fair bit is that, and both in the Parks Australia context and the NT Parks, in my experience, is this idea that they carry all the risk, and that, you know, at the end of the day, they're responsible, or either the Parks Agency or the Director of National Parks is responsible for the safety and everything that happens on the park, which can then, I feel, the feeling that then traditional owners don't actually have that power or say that they thought they had, and that the boards of management are not the final decision makers from a sort of structural point of view, and it depends on what the issue might be, in terms of how much say they might have, or how much influence they might have. And so that idea that joint management's kind of 50-50 and it's equal, isn't the case. And yeah, I mean, keeping in mind that, again, in the Northern Territory, we're talking about joint management arrangements that have been set up post-park, like the park was already there and then the joint management arrangements have been set up, rather than the other way around. But it is evolving, and there is sort of conversations now about what's next, you know, what's the future. You know, we've been operating under this particular model for quite a while now, but how can that be improved and changed, and what things need to happen for that change to take place?
Thanks, Peter. Just a lot of the presentations really talked about that tenure-based stuff and communities' perception of tenure. You know, caring for country is a wider thing for them, and I think that kind of like is a good segue to Jasmine Campbell's question, which is for Dr. Dermot Smythe. Is can you elaborate on the ability for Sea Country IPA to coexist with a marine park management plan, and what are the benefits?
Well, look, it's really no different than establishing an IPA on multiple tenures on land. If you regard the Sea Country as just another part of country. In order to have your IPA recognized by the government, you have to demonstrate that the plan of management that you've developed. And this, an IPA is established. There are these three. One is, or maybe, which in this case is done by traditional owners in an area of sea country that they have cultural responsibility for. Engage with government agencies, with commercial fishers, with tourism people, with rec fishers, other groups during that planning process. They develop a plan of management, and then they put that plan to government and say, we are inviting you to recognise this as an Indigenous protected area inside, say, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. And if you've put together all the partnerships needed to deliver on the plan of management, you know, the sustainability of fishing, the protection of sacred sites in the sea, the protection of biodiversity, all those things, you can demonstrate that what you have done effectively complements the overall Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. Because typically marine park plans are very general for very large areas. And so by developing a sea country IPA plan over a part of that marine park, what you're doing is complementing the marine park plan, and you're actually helping that marine park agency for achieving the goals that are already in their plan. The other effective thing about a sea country IPA plan is it puts a brand on country. It puts that Indigenous protected area brand on the map of that part of the marine park to make it clear to everyone that the marine park is not just an open area of sea, but it's made up of separate sea countries of the different traditional owner groups along the coast.
Peter, you had a question?
Yeah, if I can ask a question of the panel and maybe anyone else that's out there. I guess, and Dermot, I'm really interested in this idea of IPAs sitting over multiple tenures and how in practice, I get the sort of theory and the concept behind it, and it can, you know, put traditional owners in a sort of more powerful position to say, hey, this is how we want to manage country. Here you go, you know. But in reality, have we got many examples in Australia where that's happening? And has it, how is the parks agency, where an IPA sits over a park, how has the parks agency sort of coped with that whole idea of risk and you know, what sort of agreeing to certain things happening, or you know, community rangers doing, so IPA rangers sort of doing certain things on parks, and have we got some good examples of that, or can anyone talk to that?
Yeah, well, I can just add a bit more. I think we do have some good examples of that. The ones that I'm most familiar with are in Queensland, but there are others elsewhere. So I think it's important to acknowledge that when traditional owners, with help from people like us, went to the Queensland Park Service and said, we want to put country back together using an IPA, and we want to embrace your national park inside the IPA. The initial response from the park agency, pretty much at all levels, was, you know, disbelief, shock, horror, and also questions, why would you want to do that? We've got a perfectly good national park. Why do you want to complicate it with an IPA? And the example that we came up with was, especially elsewhere, you've got a World Heritage Area that sits over the wet tropics, over multiple tenures, over national parks, over environmental reserves, over fish habitat areas, all sorts of things. and it provides a sort of guiding framework for all those other areas. And the IPA is really something like that. And we multiple meetings with parks agencies, including, you know, with the director and the minister and so on, to explain that is and adding value to existing national park without threatening that park. The psychological turning point when agencies, and in the case of that one I showed before, Manding Alpai Yidinji, there was 4 here, the Forestry Department, Marine Parks, National Park, and then there was a local government reserve as well. And one by one, those people said, well, when you think about it, what have we got to lose? Because the IPA is not a legal process, so the national park is not under threat. Their plan of management stays as it is until it's modified. And so once there was an agreement in principle, we got recognition from the Commonwealth, because all the constituent parties to the IPA had agreed that they would support it. And now that particular IPA has been running for 10 years. So we have a pretty good sort of track record of seeing how it's run. There's another one down the coast, the Girrigan IPA, which that includes a total of about 40 government protected areas within the IPA, you know, small and large national parks and reserves, and a big swag of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. And one of the things that happens with these multi-tenure IPAs is that the management agencies that are responsible for the different parts of the IPA suddenly find themselves working with each other. So you have the Fisheries Agency, the Marine Park Agency, the National Park, the Forestry Department, all in the room together or out on country together, and mostly they had never communicated with each other before. So by sort of taking people along gently on that journey, they feel that it's not a threatening process. And in practice, what we're finding is that you have that overall governance arrangement, which is a sort of quite a large committee of partners chaired by traditional owners, and that meets typically, you know, once a year, maybe twice a year. But the real work, and that's important to keep the vision together, but the real work happens on these bilateral partnerships with individual agencies where they start to share resources like boats or vehicles. And in some cases, it's the IPA rangers that are better equipped with vessels, or they've got a bigger budget for fuel, and they can help the government agency do their job. I think the trick with all of these things is to see those component parts and those partner agencies as tools for traditional owners to try and achieve their vision for country. And a lot of it is a psychological trick to try everyone to see each other as part of that big objective, rather than, you know, at loggerheads about the history of the national park or the marine park, which is often very unpleasant. But with goodwill and good individuals, you can, you know, achieve a lot.
Cool.
Can I just comment on that as well, please, in relation to an example in Queensland?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Yep.
Yeah. So you can go and have a look at the Daintree National Park Management Plan. It's a statutory plan. It's come out of the Jabal-Bini Yalanji Aboriginal Corporation's IPAs. It was written and went through a process and it won a Premier's Award. And as I talked about before, they basically got told, you're not going to do another national park plan. You need to work with Jabal-Bini and write your national park plan out, the Indigenous Protected Area Plan. And there's a process that was gone through with the board and some work with that Aboriginal corporation to achieve that plan. It was much more efficient. It saved the government a heap of money than going around talking to Aboriginal people again about all the things that just spoken about. And it became the statutory instrument. It's a values-based plan, and that's the way that national park plans are all done in Queensland now. And that's the way that our IPA is done. I just also want to comment about misconceptions. I think there's a huge misconception within Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service, but I think in the Northern Territory, from what I've heard, is that, you know, national parks agencies are there to run national parks. That's not the only thing they're supposed to be doing when it comes to joint management. They're supposed to be building the capacity of Aboriginal people and Aboriginal corporations to be jointly managing those parks, and in Queensland, in many instances, moving towards having those organisations run those sections of the national park, because those organisations can bring in more funding, more resources, and under the Nature Conservation Act in Queensland, Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service cannot protect the cultural values in those national parks, so they're not meeting their responsibilities under legislation to protect those cultural values. All they're doing is focusing on a scientific approach. So Aboriginal people working with science, working cooperatively with national parks, can actually deliver a better outcome for national parks and national park management for the community. And the problem is that the chief executive of the Department of Environment and Science well, not him, but the Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service. You're talking about conflicts of interest with leases in the Northern Territory from the Aboriginal group. The actual Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service, they've got a huge conflict of interest because they control the funding, they control everything, and they don't actually build capacity because they're so focused on managing national parks. And there needs to be a change where the Department of Environment and Science Chief Executive Officer is also looking at the capacity of the Aboriginal corporations as compared to their own agency, and we will work towards being better placed to manage national parks than they are. But the culture within, the perception with those Queensland Parks and Wildlife Services, oh, we'll sign the document and then we'll keep doing what we've always done. And the only way you change that is politically, to go to the Minister, deal with the Director General and work through those processes. And I don't know if Karen wants to comment, but that's sort of what we're working towards doing at Woothity here.
And the IMA outlines for it in clause 4.1, 4.3 and 4.9, which is the changing of the executor.
Yeah, so in our Indigenous Management Agreement, they're supposed to devolve power and responsibility to the Aboriginal corporation, but they're not doing it.
The only part that's missing is the develop a transitional roadmap for each group.
Thanks, Jim and Kieran and Dr. Dermott for answering that question. I think we've got another live question from Jose. Is that right? Am I right? No, yep.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. Yeah, my question is to the presenters from Queensland, Victoria, and NT. In your respective states and territories, are you part of any network, dealing with joint management? Like, are you in touch with neighboring groups, also on the path of joint management or doing joint management? I'm curious to know if there is any sort of formal exchange taking place in your respective states and territories.
John, Bill, do you want me to go first?
Yep, thank you.
Thanks, Jose. It's a really good question, and I think basically the answer is I don't think there is certainly across states. That within the NT there are forums, between the sort of top end and central areas from time to time, but there's no. It's sort of opportunistic, or when people sort of just decide to do it. It's not kind of a regular thing, so to speak. I just, having started at Parks Australia recently, I have just tapped into there's sort of a national heads of park forum that has kicked off, and I don't know a heap about its history, but it's been raised in that forum. This idea of developing a community of practice, which I think is a really good idea, and I think there's so much joint management happening across the country, or collaborative arrangements, that I think some kind of forum, community of practice, type thing would be totally fantastic. And I think broadening it out, I think the heads of parks thing is just parks agencies at the moment. It's not traditional owner organisations in the NT, the CLC and NLC are quite large players, and they do arrange forums between the various stakeholders from time to time. But something more structured and formal and inclusive would be fantastic, I think.
Yeah, Bill, GLOWAC's the same. We sort of have that structure here. We do have like a what they call a TOM board. They're a traditional owner land management board, and they, I think, attend forums on behalf of GLOWAC to other groups here in Victoria. And then we have like our in parks itself, we have a what we call Aboriginal Staff Network. So they've now just invited, this year's probably one of the second, I think, they've invited GLOWAC Rangers to attend those networks. So they go for a week and they just talk about issues and stuff that's in the parks. So that'll be interesting to see what the GK Rangers, that's coming up in October. So it'll be interesting to see what they what the Rangers get out of that. We haven't had one for a few years because of COVID. But yeah, we do have. I think our CEO here at GLOWAC too has been going to some native title forums as well. So that kind of gets out the information and stuff too, what we're doing in our part of the world.
Thanks, Kathy. Jim or Karen, did you want to tackle that question as well?
Basically, the jointly managed, there's about 17 jointly management parks, or 13 or 17 in Cape York Peninsula. The way the parks run it is they have an advisory committee that hasn't been meeting for about 12 months or so, that brings somebody from each of those different areas together, but that actually don't facilitate a Cape York-wide joint management forum for the different groups. I think it's something that needs to happen. I think it could be run through that, or else we could do it again through Indigenous Land and Sea Rangers, or else through IPAs to actually bring people together. My concern with sort of just a parks-focused joint management is just everyone's got a different experience of colonisation and different experience of tenure and legislation, and the focus then is about that. Whereas I think what really is important is actually the Aboriginal groups, or the Torres Strait Islander groups also in our instance, getting clear about what's their agenda and how they can work together to try and progress that. And so, yeah, it's a bit of a mixture of just sort of focusing on joint management. With this forum's been good. I didn't have enough. I had some understanding of Northern Territory because I've read some of that legislation through some research I've done, but I had very little understanding of Victoria and Western Australia. So yeah, that'd be my comment. Karen might want to add, but I think getting people together is useful, but you just got to make sure what agenda is being run by that.
Cool, thanks.
Thank you.
Just an update. Look, we're still not able to get the Wreck Bay crew IT issue sorted out, but we will aim to have their presentation available in the resource gallery post-event, so you can read up on what Wreck Bay are doing in their area with the Geovillis Bay. I think we've got another live question. We have Jody Neal on the line. Yeah.
Hi. I am involved in negotiations for a joint management conservation or jointly managed conservation area in WA. And while we see many positives, there is some concern that maybe the longer experience of some of you in other parts of Australia is relevant to, which is that when there is a dispute in the Joint Management Board, then the agreement reverts back to the executive function of the minister. So if it can't be resolved and the mediation process doesn't work, then in the end, the minister makes the decision. So I'm really interested. Someone earlier talked about collective problem solving. I'm really interested in what that might look like, if anyone has good ideas, including what we might put into the initial agreements, which we're currently negotiating, as a dispute resolution mechanism that might enforce a process that is more likely to work for TOs, the one that might be a more Western bureaucratic mediation mechanism.
You know you're wrong.
Does anybody want to tackle that first?
I think I was the one that mentioned collaborative problem solving in my presentation, Jody, and yeah, it's a really good question, and I think I'm involved in renegotiating the leases at the moment for Kakadu and Uluru, and there is dispute resolution or dispute mechanisms in there, but yeah, it's really, you know, you want to sort of be able to work through things before getting to, you know, having to go to mediation. If you're at that point, things aren't going too well, and I think that how do you build approaches and philosophies or ways of working into legal documents is really tricky, I think, and I'm not sure whether anyone's really nailed it yet, but because how to work effectively in a joint management environment requires a particular approach and skills and capacity. So I'm probably not really answering your question, but yeah, I'm not sure how you can really capture that within leases. I mean, we're looking at joint management principles and other mechanisms to try and build it in, but we're working through that at the moment. But yeah, it's tricky. Sorry, I'm not really answering your question there. But
can I just comment on it as well? I mean, the legal document in Queensland has you can go to dispute and you've got to resolve for 10 days, and then you can go to, somebody will appoint a mediator and you can go through that process. Independent legal advice and the like. So that's the process. That's in the agreement. I think you've got to understand your agreements. You've got to make them as best as possible. But the approach and some of the experience I've had is the pub test. So in the end, if it gets back to the minister has to decide whether this is an argument that's sustainable for them in the public discourse. And by the time it's got to that stage, generally, from my experience, it's unsustainable what the government's doing and the department's doing. The minister, and I think the important thing is the minister and the government increasingly understands what this is about, which is this about empowering Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and moving towards that agenda. Like nationally, we've got the Uluru Statement for the Heart, Indigenous First Nations at the front and centre of political discourse. So you need to think about that process and how you use your agreements, but also engage politically, because in the end, then national parks tend to collapse and get you what you want because they don't want to be embarrassed about what's going to happen. And that's how we got the win with the national park plan in the Jabal Binner instance, because it's embarrassing for them.
And we are landlords.
Thanks for that. I think we're heading into a 2-minute warning. I think we've got one final question for this session from Dr. Bill Cruz.
Oh, hi, everybody. A question for DBCA in Western Australia, for those listening from other parts of the State-Based Conservation Agency. They're called DBCA. My experience of working on IPAs and in national parks is there always seems to be a DBCA person running around on an IPA as well. It also seems to be quite different in Queensland and the Territory, much more divided, for want of a better word. How do you guys actually support IPAs in Western Australia? I mean, how do you see your role and what is the kind of support you provide?
Have we got someone from DBCA able to come into the...
We've got Craig, I think.
Yeah. Oh, we just need to be able to pull them into the main stage to answer the question. Are you about, Craig?
He's,
Okay. Looks like
yeah, he is. He's on the, yeah, well, he's certainly on the discussion group. He's got his hand up.
okay. Yep. And look, I want to thank everyone thus far before Craig comes in for all the questions that have been coming through and utilising that live option as well. And definitely the panel members for answering some of them questions. And it's quite been some interesting answers and quite a different range of joint management opportunities and challenges. Yeah. So I think we've got Craig. Thanks, Craig.
Yeah, g'day. Thanks, Bill. And yeah, I suppose the experience I've had in the Kimberleys are a little bit different to some of the examples that have been provided. I think one of the ones we're trying to really do is work closely with some of the IPAs, especially where they overlap with the conservation estate. So yeah, for that example, we've recently co-designed Buccaneer Archipelago Marine Park, and that's on two fronts. You've got Bardi Jawi, who already have an IPA and doing some really good work, and how do we actually work together to sort of allow the research and monitoring they're doing with different groups to continue, but then yeah, sort of value add to that with some of the additional science and work that we can bring to the table from the department. And then working with Myala, who haven't got a healthy country plan, and providing the support for that to get over the line. And then again, sort of work with them, sort of, and the ranges that they know more than likely to get through that IPA process to again combine resources and do that work. I think a lot of the joint management focus that we've got in the Kimberley is whether it's direct employees or whether it's IPA rangers. How do we build that capacity of the groups? How do we, with the right training officers, with the right support staff, structures, rangers that we've got? So really trying to combine resources, but also sort of focus on the skills and the training to build the capacity of both staff who are directly employed, but that flexibility of those who are doing fee-for-service works. And I think Ben talked about some of that stuff in Nongamata, where they're doing the turtle monitoring, for example, at Anna Plains, and ourselves are doing it sort of a bit further down at 80 Mile Beach Caravan Park. So there's some of that work. We're also, when we're sort of talking about threatened species, we often support and been working with different groups like Environs Kimberley, the different IPA groups sort of in some of the desert country. And we go, whether it's our scientists from Perth or conservation staff from the Kimberley, going out and trying to provide sort of ID skills and sort of technical support to IPA ranger group led sort of conservation works or monitoring works. But that's off tenure. But it's really on that threatened species side of things that Parks and Wildlife Service has a responsibility, or sort of some skin in the game from a state government sort of threatened species protection, biodiversity conservation act bill side of things. So we are, that primary focus is on national parks for the tenure that we manage, but I don't think it has to exclusively be that. And I think we're more and more recognising that broader country approach. So some of those threats, like it's been said here, doesn't stop at a boundary. Some of those cultural values sort of aren't sort of physical places, they sort of extend across sort of country. And I think while the primary focus is on national parks, and that's sort of what we do, trying to look a bit broader than that and look at opportunities and how we can sort of help sort of meet some of those aspirations of traditional owners is really, really important for us in the Kimberley.
Thanks, Craig. I would like to close the Q&A session now. Just got to remind people that we have another session that we're going to be going straight into. So just a reminder, it's back through that timeline, and we will be going across into another session, where to from here, which will be, so I thank everyone again for their presentations today. Thank you for your involvement in the Q&A. And we'll see you in the next session. Where to from here? Click back into your timeline, click into where to from now session, and I'll see you there very soon.